Hey guys, it's Billy from DCC, and I just want to take a few minutes here and kind of address a question that comes up oftentimes around this year, especially during Holy Week, as we celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And one of the questions that kind of comes up is, what day was Jesus crucified? Specifically because Jesus said that he would be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, just like Jonah in Matthew 12. And so how are we to understand this kind of time designation? Is it literal? Do we understand it in some other way? Because if he was crucified on Friday, he's not buried for 3 days and 3 nights. And so this is one of those things where we just want to kind of look at it a little bit closer and examine this idea. And I just want to give a shout out to Chad Bird, Old Testament scholar with 1517, who I'm definitely using some of his thoughts here to help answer this question, because he's summed it up in such a good way. But the idea is this, is that every language has certain expressions. They're called idioms, not to be confused with idiots, even though I feel like every language has some of those as well too, that a speaker kind of unfamiliar with that language finds hard to understand. For example, here in English, we would say things like kick the bucket in order to mean somebody dies, or it's a piece of cake to refer to it being easy. But to non-English speakers, they would hear those just straight up out of context and not understand what they mean. And so those only make sense to native speakers. And I feel like the same applies to how we talk about time in certain ways. For example, if I text my wife and say, hey, I'm going to be home in a couple minutes, but then I walk in the door 10 minutes later, she doesn't act surprised and ask me why I wasn't there in exactly 2 minutes, because she understands the idiom, a couple of minutes means soon. Similarly, if my son and I were working on a project in the garage or working on yard work, and around 5 o'clock I say, hey, let's call it a day. He doesn't say, Dad, it's not midnight, we can't call this a day yet. As a native speaker, as somebody who speaks English, he knows that a day means to call it a day means to stop working, even if only part of a day has passed. So we do this already in English, but it's the same way with Hebrew, the language of Israel. Hebrew had thousands of idiomatic expressions. Lots of them are quite colorful. For example, one instance where Hebrew describes God's patience, it says that he has a long nose. His nose is long. That means he's patient. Just picture that for a second. And the language also uses time, uses idiomatic expressions to talk about time as well. For example, Hebrew often uses a phrase that literally means yesterday 3 days, and forgive my pronunciation, it's Tmal Shasam, yesterday 3 days. And depending on the context, it can mean yesterday, or it can mean previously. Like in Exodus, one spot where it uses it literally means just in the past. It doesn't mean literally 72 hours in the past or a time period within the last 24 hours. It just means before now or before today. Also, in Hebrew, the expression third day does not necessarily mean a literal third day. For instance, in Hosea 6:2, the prophet says, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live before him. Now, in Hosea, we know that he's talking about a future event in which he will bring Israel home to himself, not something that he's going to do after 24 hours or 48 hours have elapsed. And Hosea is just reflecting this kind of common tradition in the Old Testament of significant events happening on the third day. For instance, think about your Old Testament just a little bit, right? Abraham and Isaac reached Mount Moriah. When? Genesis 22:4. On the third day. God descended onto Sinai. Exodus 19:11. On the third day. Jonah was in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah 1:17. The tradition of God doing something big on the third day, by the way, was also probably what Paul was referring to when he said that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. He wasn't referring to a specific scripture, a proof text, if you were, but to this grouping of events, this prophetic pattern of messages and what they implied. We also see an interesting thing about the third day in the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, after 3 days can mean on the third day. When she was preparing to go before the king, Esther asked her fellow Jews to not eat or drink for 3 days or night or day. And on the surface, it would suggest, if we were to literally take it like that, that on the fourth day, after these 3-day period of preparation, Esther would go to the king. But no, if you read Esther 5:1, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the king's presence. So after 3 days, in Hebrew language and idiomatic speaking, it meant on the third day. The same way of speaking continued throughout the years, throughout the Old Testament, throughout the period between the Old and the New Testament. If you read some of the Jewish writings, such as the Talmud, when Jewish scholars discussed days and partial days, for the rabbis, part of a day was equal to the whole day. And so when he says 3 days and 3 nights, it could literally mean, this phraseology could mean, just parts of a day. And we do that too. In English, we'll say, I've been working on this project for night and day just to get it done, right? Of course, we don't mean that we've been working literal 24-hour periods, rather that we've been putting in long hours each day. And so in Hebrew, 3 days and 3 nights do not need to consist of 3 full 24-hour periods. 3 partial days will suffice. It's not much different in English when somebody says, hey, I'll get back to you in 3 or 4 days, and then they proceed to respond to you in 2 days or 5 days. We're not really surprised because we know that 3 or 4 days is not to be taken literally. So all of that is kind of background for us to understand when Jesus says in Matthew 12:40, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. If we were to understand this literally as English speakers, then Jesus would not have been raised on the third day, but on the fourth day, after the supposedly 72-hour time period has passed. But as we saw with Esther and some other places, after 3 days simply means on the third day. In short, Jesus, as a Jew, was thinking and speaking in typical Hebrew fashion. So there's no contradiction between the traditional understanding of Jesus' time in the grave on Friday being the day that he was crucified. There's no contradiction between that and the 3 days and 3 nights in Matthew chapter 12. We've just got to bear in mind that language uses expressions about time that, when taken literally, will always be misunderstood. So whatever language Jesus may have been speaking, whether Aramaic or Hebrew is probably what he was speaking when he said those words, his expression and his minds were shaped by the Hebrew scriptures, by their mode of expression, and by the mode and the usage of language in his day. He wasn't going to adapt his language to 21st century English-speaking Americans. Rather, what we have to do is adapt our thoughts, our teachings, our expressions to that context, that language, that culture. And when we do, we'll realize that the partial days of Good Friday, then all of Silent Saturday, and part of Sunday are 3 days and 3 nights. Whether you agree with this assessment or not, I hope that it's been helpful for you, and I pray that God will continue to bless you as you consider him and as you reflect on the sacrifice of Jesus this Holy Week. God bless.